Hello. I have not connected it yet.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm about to. All right, cool. Hey, everyone. My name is Juan. I'm here to talk to you about Regen CryptoEconomics for good. And could I get a quick show of hands who is familiar with the Regen crypto movement? A few people. A lot of people. That's great. How would you gauge, like, raise your hand by, like, degree of familiarity with it? Like, you're like a Regen, maybe not a maximalist, but like super into the green pill Regen movement, kind of halfway. Like, you kind of know something about it, but like not a ton. Like, hey, you're not familiar. Great, awesome. So this talk is for all of you. But that just calibrates how much I should explain of different things and how much I should not bore you. Great, so one of the claims of this talk is that if Regen, WAGMI, else NGMI. So if we can achieve regenerative cryptoeconomics to achieve Pyrotopian, then we're all going to make it. And if we don't, then we're pretty screwed. So there we go. So the talk is going to go through these set of things. I'm going to intro Regen CryptoEcon. I'm going to talk about what Pyrotopian is and how to achieve it. I'm going to walk through two examples that are both massive and break them down into smaller chunks so we can think of like how to scale it up and how to cause an incentive structure build up towards fixing that problem. Then I'm going to give you a whole bunch of Regen ideas that people are talking about right now. And I'm going to end with like how to get involved and how to take your Regen ideas forward, how to join the movement, and how to improve the world. Great, so I'm going to use the memetics of Green Pilled, which is a movement that the Gitcoin folks, and especially Kevin Owocki and a whole other folks, have been producing. The memes are awesome, so I'm going to rely on the great illustrations of the book. You should definitely get this book and check out the podcast. So take the Green Pill and on. The basics of the Green Pill movement, in a sense, and Regen CryptoEcon is that first, the whole planet is filled with coordination failures. We'll talk more about that in a moment. We understand that, and we understand the problem space, and we also understand a set of solution possibilities. And so we reject the numerism, and we are going to try and build a much better future. Web3 is a big moment it presents a ton of opportunities, and it's a big shelling point in a sense of people that want to cause this kind of action and this kind of change. The tools that we're going to use are mechanism design and tools around using game theory and crypto networks and so on, leaning into all the crypto blockchains that we built. And with that, we aim to generate a massively generative and regenerative crypto economy that is going to kind of eclipse all of the other kind of degen, more dystopian perspectives of the future. And we're going to get there by both talking about all of these ideas and creating spaces for implementing those ideas, creating spaces for showcasing those things, and once we find things that work, pour tons of energy and resources into scaling those to cause massive change. The basics of all this is that everything is about coordination. So humans are social animals. Humans have been building many different kinds of institutions over millennia that are basically about different ways of coordinating parties to achieve various goals, from early hunter-gatherer tribes, or even before that, packs and families and so on, all the way to modern nation states and modern crypto networks and so on. there's many different ways of coordinating across many layers of the stack. And you can even go into biology and think about coordination in terms of an integrated system that is a body and an integrated system that is one of the major organ systems, or the organs themselves, or the cells, and so on. So everything is about how to coordinate different kinds of pieces of a large system to get to certain objectives. The cool thing is that CryptoEcon gives us massive levers to coordinate the planet. So what is cryptoeconomics? It's a field of study that involves many different tangential disciplines. So things like economics itself, things like cryptography, things like game theory, mechanism design, optimization, control theory. All of these kinds of things blend together into cryptoeconomic systems. Mechanism design is really useful. The way to kind of think about it is that game theory is the study and theories behind studying some incentive structure and understanding what the strategy landscape looks like for a set of agents in a game. Mechanism is game theory in reverse, where you set a goal and you're trying to create mechanism and now analyze the landscape to figure out how you need to warp the incentive field to achieve that outcome. So it's kind of like applied game theory with specific sets of goals. Now with crypto, we can lean into building systems like that have all kinds of malicious parties and coordination failures and so on to sort of get there. So what is Regen CryptoEcon? Regen CryptoEcon is about building systems that are not just kind of, that are certainly not extractive and are not just resilient and sustainable, but they're also regenerative. They have all kinds of positive externalities to the systems around it, and you try to minimize the negative externalities to try and sort of create these holons that are just kind of emitting value and emitting energy. And if you can create systems like that, then you can scale them up over time, coordinate between systems like that, and over time lift massive problems. So let's talk about coordination failures for a moment. Coordination failures are kind of at the core of many of the problems that we have today. So everything from something as large as nation states fighting over resources and fighting about the nuclear arms race and the buildup there was a massive coordination failure between the two largest macro coordination systems that we had. We have much smaller examples like maintenance of software, maintenance of infrastructure, taxing systems, where the tax money actually goes, and so on. So the world is rife with coordination failures. And often a lot of it comes from lack of knowledge. Often a lot of it comes from lack of mechanisms that arrive at a good incentive structure for all parties in the system. So there's a set of memes around Moloch, which is, I think came from Slate Star Codex's Meditations on Moloch, which is an essay that kind of talks about all of these terrible coordination failures that are really at the core of all major problems in the world, and sort of try to imagine some like demon god of coordination failure, and like that's what Moloch is. So if you've heard of Moloch DAO and like slaying Moloch and so on, like that's what it's about. It's about like, hey, humans tend to respond better by like visualizing an enemy and trying to fight it. So let's name that coordination failure god Moloch and so on. And the Web3 movement is kind of like leaning into those memetics and saying, great, like we're going to use Web3 and all of these amazing mechanisms to slay Moloch. And so like that's where all of that comes from. And the Green Pill movement has like this really nice pipeline of taking the super fast-growing and super capable and super amazing crypto community, and go from like the early incentives that bring a lot of people into crypto to that are kind of like exiting or trying to improve on other financial systems, come into crypto because of that, and then over time they sort of like realize the potential of the potential of crypto and the potential to become Regen, and that's kind of like how things flow. At the end of the day, like what we're trying to break coordination failures for is to kind of build a drastically better potential future, usually mediated by all kinds of public goods that we need to generate to help humanity flourish, help other species flourish, and achieve a good long-term progress. So let's kind of look at game theory and public goods for a moment. So who here knows like what a public good is like fully well and like doesn't need a definition? Great, most people. So the idea, like most goods that you buy and you pay some money for, some currency for, and you purchase and you can use, is a private good. These tend to be excludable or rivalrous. Usually excludable and rivalrous. Excludable means that when you use it, somebody else can't use it. So software is not like this. Ideas are not like this. You can have an idea, you can tell it to me, now we can both have that idea. Rivalrous means that when you I think it's when you use it, you get to yeah, sorry, that's rivalrous. Excludable is that you can or cannot toll it. So for example, yeah, mistake. Let me rewind. Definition. So when I consume it and when you consume it, that's rivalrous. Excludable is whether or not we can kind of like cordon off the good and toll people into it. So for example, the air is not really excludable. A public pool that you can build a fence around is excludable. So you can create a toll booth for people coming through, and you can exclude the participation. And so that's kind of, public goods are kind of all of these large-scale infrastructure pieces that are not excludable, so you can't toll them, and you can't kind of build them with tolling. And they're also non-rivalrous. Now, the public goods notion is like kind of messy because what public are we talking about? Certainly access to specific good is not universal. Not everyone has access to the same good at the same level. So I like to think of like network goods in reality, which are goods specific to a network of parties that agree on some set of things. So think of like the Ethereum blockchain is a network good in a sense, and so on. So with CryptoEcon and Web3, we can kind of lean on the fact that we know how to create incentives, we know how to create incentive structures and deploy them into the network, and start using programmable money to build these kinds of infrastructure that is going to fund many major kind of public goods. We've already built a bunch of crypto networks that are these public goods. We've already built a bunch of DAOs that are causing some impact in the world. We can scale that up and cause many larger scales of impact. So great, so let's go into coordination games for a moment. When you kind of study some incentive structure in a coordination game, you end up with this kind of like a traditional game theory style analysis of a game where like you can think through the different parties, you can think of their payoffs and so on. And they're like classic games that show coordination failures. Like very famously, kind of the prisoner's dilemma has this classic kind of like defect equilibrium where like all parties tend to defect, even though all parties would be better off if they coordinated. So that's so all of this study of these kinds of games enables us to turn zero-sum games where you have fixed resources into positive-sum games where you can tweak the incentive structure, you can use mechanisms to orient people towards coordination, towards growing the pie as opposed to fighting for the pie. So you can, in general, for most of the universal resources, you can generally either encounter some conflict and fight for splitting some set of resources, or you can focus on growing the pie and growing the resources. And we'll get a little bit more into that in a moment with Pyrotopian. Once you start constructing simple incentive structures and you start scaling them and composing them and building larger systems, you start building incentive fields. And you can think of these as large-scale surfaces that you allow parties to dynamically optimize through. So for example, you can coordinate larger and larger groups of people by building these like open-ended permissionless incentive structures that all parties can see and can engage with and so on. And you can coordinate large action by creating a different equilibrium. Most of the time when you are like frustrated about some problem in the world and you kind of start thinking about it, start analyzing it, and usually you'll end up finding some broken equilibrium. And usually it'll be people are just stuck in some basin, and usually a lot of people in that basin know that it's very possible to arrive at a different basin that is much better for everybody, but people can't coordinate their way out of it. It's very difficult for individual parties to kind of get out of it. There's a great book called Inadequate Equilibria that goes deeply into this and kind of why those basins form and why it's very difficult to get out of it. And the gist of it is you end up in a structure where there are multiple different parties that have different strategies, and if one of them starts like taking a different, more pro-social attitude, it's easy for the other parties to kind of take advantage of that. And so it's difficult to coordinate everyone out of that basin at the same time. But with CryptoEcon, by creating mechanisms, you can start like warping that surface and maybe like moving them, like destroying the mountain in between those two basins to enable everyone to flow out. So that's the kind of the major promise of the whole thing. There's many kinds of great economic theories that we can rely on. The Elinor Ostrom's principles for managing a commons is a great example, being able to kind of reason about how parties can use a commons and so on. And this is a great example of like building robust incentive structures for managing the commons and for funding the commons and maintaining the commons, which was a kind of, before Ostrom, a kind of open problem or like intractable problem to solve. So where a lot of this is headed, at least right now in the Web3 space, is that many times major problems have many people that know how to solve the problem and know how to create solutions, but they're lacking the time and resources to implement those solutions. So a lot of times today, in 21st century, what many of those groups need is funding, and funding at larger scales. So funding is one of the easy ways to solve a lot of these problems, finding structures that can fund those groups. Now, you have to make sure to understand what the impact of that funding is and whether or not that's incentive aligned. And so you have to create funding structures that can measure impact and then cascade that. But at the end of the day, you'll see a lot of the ideas right now in the last few years and probably in the next few years will relate to how do you fund larger and larger impact groups at various different kinds of scales. And so a lot of the study right now is around different kinds of distribution models for funding, that how do you get funding to the groups that have like the best ideas for how to solve problems the best, or like the most effectively, fastest, and most distributed around the world, and so on. And then there's a whole set of study around, as you're scaling funding to groups, how does that perform? What is that impact? Could you do better, and so on. So you have like capital deployment and maybe assessment of how the capital is being deployed, but you now need to kind of create a feedback mechanism to be able to generate more and more capital to fund at larger and larger scales. So this is where things like the sort of value generation of crypto networks in general can be hooked into these mechanisms, right? So if you have a system that is funding public goods, and we all know that when we have these goods, we can get more capital for other reasons. For example, the fact that these blockchains exist enable us to build monetary systems and enable businesses that enable cash flows and so on, and money generation, then you can feed some fraction of that into funding the public goods themselves, right? So in a sense, this is kind of what nation states do. Nation states do that kind of feeding of the kind of, they tax societies and take some fraction of that tax and feed it into funding of public goods like science and so on. And that's kind of like from a enlightened perspective of saying, great, we know these public goods are really valuable long term. Let's fund them. Let's take some of the proceeds of the society and fund these larger public goods. The problem is that the funding structures in these groups are not that great, and they're not scaling with the capital generation elsewhere. We'll see that in a moment of how like the science funding has not kept pace with the GDP growth of the world, and there are major problems in between how do you go from science into technology and broad diffusion. So there's all kinds of mechanisms that people are exploring. So everything from quadratic voting and conviction voting, staking, bonding curves, and so on. I'll kind of like flash a few of these right now for you to explore. A bunch of these ideas have been, many of them have been proposed many decades ago, in some cases centuries. Some of them are very new. But what's really cool about blockchains is that you can now have a software system that enables you to broadcast all of these kinds of mechanisms and deploy them into the network at scale, right? So you're no longer rate limited. So before crypto, economists would have to like come up with a mechanism, write a bunch of papers, and then start to try and convince large-scale governments or large-scale institutions to build that kind of mechanism and that kind of incentive field. And that's an extremely slow process. In the crypto world, you can dream up a new incentive structure, deploy into the network, see what happens, study it, and then from there scale it. Now that's also dangerous. You can definitely deploy bad incentive structures, so be careful. But it gives you this very, very powerful tool that you can use to understand the world, try to solve some problem, and as an individual or a small group, actually deploy a solution. And if it's working, then you'll get scale will follow. There's all kinds of problems and potential opportunities. I highly encourage you to check out the book. It goes into a bunch of these possibilities. And the book kind of finishes with like a good notion of impact DAOs and kind of starts painting the future of potential DAOs formed around creating impact on some specific vertical kind of case. And the whole movement in general is kind of very oriented around this kind of, again, regenerative economics that are trying to orient and align incentives towards kind of maximal flourishing. Great, so I will now switch gears to, so that's kind of the Green Pill movement and Regen Crypto and kind of the underlying technical foundations, but also kind of the social and mimetic structure around it. Check out the book for more and get involved with the broader movement. So let's go into, so now that like we have those like strong foundations and we have like a sense of like the general goal, let's kick it up a notch and now talk about Pyrotopian. So at the end of the day, I think we live in an extremely critical century, and I'll convince you why. We've had tremendous global improvement over millennia and maybe tens of thousands of years, and certainly in the last few hundred years, we've seen by most indicators that we have about human well-being and the well-being of groups and so on, the world has been getting dramatically better. Life expectancy, poverty rates, health, and so on, by most measures, the world is getting dramatically better. It doesn't feel that way because our media and other systems are kind of co-opted by interest groups that push all kinds of like conflict memes to try and achieve outcomes. But in general, most groups that take this longer view and longer view of study can point to just the world getting dramatically better over time. However, we're also faced with extremely large challenges this century. Sorry, 1 second. I think I missed a. Yeah, I'll go this one first. We're faced with X risks, which are these existential risks that might wipe out the species. So, for example, there are these major nation states with nuclear weapons. There's one of them is like in a war right now, and it's for a while there it looked really scary. Still scary for a lot of people, and this still could escalate. We also have a massive disaster around climate change. We have potential problems around biotech, potential problems around AGI. So all of these are major technological improvements that, because they enhance our technology enhance our capabilities, it has great positive potential and also great negative potential. So that this creates the possibility of coordination failures that get us into a really bad state. So this is why we need to create very strong coordination structures to achieve really good outcomes. And so the reason this century is extremely critical is that while other X risks, which are natural, so things like supervolcanoes or asteroid impacts or supernova and so on, those the scale and timing of those is so large that will likely kind of colonize the planets and go out to potentially other stars before one of those things happens. However, in this century, there are major X risks that we have to make it through. And one of those is the kind of computing phase transition. There's this, if you kind of look at the history of computing and you think of the last 80 years and how decade over decade computing infrastructure has improved human life, and you sort of start projecting that 80 years in the future, a lot of the tech that we've known about and we've dreamed about for the last few decades will likely come to pass. Computing is one of these kind of interesting things that is so fundamentally powerful, and it's so kind of, it's such a tremendous physical process that once we've been able to harness it, it's going to rewire what we are. Computing is not like about digital computers on its own. Living systems are a computing system. Neural and mimetic systems are a computing system. Digital computers are a computing system. All of these things have the three kind of like major events in the planet in the last 4 billion years are different layers of computing stacks. So this transition is like super dangerous because if we get it right, this could be phenomenally great for the whole species. And it can lock in like this amazing open-ended progress. However, we screw it up if we like build, things like brain-computer interfaces, things like AGI, and so on are extremely powerful technologies that if we like misalign them or don't broadly diffuse them and so on, they could spell catastrophic outcomes for the species. So this is an extremely critical century. And one of the weird things here is that early on in computing's history, we got the implications of building computing machines and computing machines that can think and so on sort of generated a ton of sci-fi that kind of helped us view potential futures. And so we've gotten this very rich cultural set of memes that can paint various possible pictures of what the future might look like and force us to contend with implications. Unfortunately, the sci-fi perspective has like, because it's science fiction, the world finds it really easy to just dismiss all of those ideas as just purely fiction, and yet we're just marching decade over decade straight into this. Brain-computer interfaces are not that far away. They're probably on the order of like 10 to 20 years out from being able to actuate most computers directly from your brain, or later on connecting brains together and so on. AGI is very unclear. This is, the building of AGI has been predicted for many, many decades, and those timelines were always over-optimistic, but now most of the experts have like radically shrunk their timelines. In the last 10, 15 years, we've gone from most experts thinking somewhere between 50 and 300 years down to somewhere between 10 to 30 years. And that timeline shrink is alarming because if we don't get this right, it could be bad. So with all of these things, so like an enormous global improvement, very scary X risks that we have to avert that are stemming from coordination failures, and this really important computing phase transition that we're like engaging in. Unfortunately, our current macro systems are not very adequate to help us solve these major problems. These were really great for getting us here and getting us to this point and driving a lot of the improvement, but they're not able to contend with these kinds of coordination failures, and they're not able to contend with something like a phase transition, like what computing is causing. So hopefully, like the picture is like clear. Like this is a very, very critical century. Now, what are we going to do about it? The good news on all of this is that we have like just in time, we have figured out extremely powerful coordination tooling. All of these potential failures stem from coordination problems. These are macro-scale coordination problems, but you can usually break down macro-scale coordination problems into smaller and smaller pieces that you can then meaningfully contribute to and meaningfully solve. So let me introduce you to a kind of concept called Pyrotopian, and then kind of give you a tool set for how you can achieve large-scale improvement by kind of breaking down those problems. There's a great talk called Pyrotopian goal alignment from Drexler, who's one of the kind of inventors of a lot of the crypto stuff that we use today. Eric Drexler and Mark Miller, kind of in the 70s, 80s, wrote the Agoric papers, which kind of described computing with markets and currencies and the ability to kind of like trade resources and having digital money and so on. And it just took a very long time for those ideas to percolate and make it into our global systems and now get scaled. And so part of what they talked about was that there was this concept of Pyrotopian, and it's really useful to kind of visualize that picture. So imagine kind of a very simple resource sharing structure. So you can think of like two agents, A and B, and you can think of just one resource. Like there's just the uniform notion of like all resources. And this is the picture of a zero-sum game where they're kind of like trading off resources perfectly. Let's kind of like plot it on a log scale. So like that bulges it out. That takes that straight line and bulges it out, which is useful to kind of visualize growth in a moment. And then most people kind of now in the last 150 years have recognized that like, hey, actually, most resource growth is not, most resource taking creation is not a zero-sum game. And in reality, you can, instead of conflicting with each other, we can coordinate and we can arrive at kind of broad resource growth. We can grow the pie instead of kind of compete for the pie. And so you end up with this really nice kind of Pareto frontier. Pareto frontier is like that line of like the potential kind of choices that people might make, and they can coordinate to try and grow the resources. Now, but most kind of systems and governments and so on are built upon this kind of picture, where like growth is kind of a small fraction of what you have now. You're kind of like growing at 5% a year, or 10% a year, 50% a year. But when you zoom out, the reality is that we're growing at in terms of many orders of magnitude. When you think of something like as pivotal as germ theory and the ability to kind of have sanitation and understand microorganisms and them as a cause for disease, and then kicking off like all kinds of health innovation systems, that it creates a massive scale of improvement. Same thing with communication technology, being able to kind of go from a world where you had to like send letters to each other to suddenly having the telegraph and then the telephone and then radio and then the internet. Like that kind of growth creates orders of magnitude more resources and so on. We don't see this in most of our measures, like GDP and so on, because those measures tend to like just look at what people are willing to pay currently, which create this structure where like once you create a lot of value that is broadly diffused, it's sort of like nobody will pay anything for it because it's just so cheap that GDP doesn't capture this kind of growth. So if you were capturing this kind of growth, GDP would be like many orders of magnitude of growth every century or something like that. So this is kind of like the fundamental idea here, which is that if we coordinate to scale our resources, to do the kind of deep science work and deep technology translation work and deep product diffusion work to get all of that tech out there, we can get into this much faster pathway to growing the well-being and resources for the species and for many other species, for all of life and so on. So that kind of perspective here is what Pyrotopia is about. And one critical thing here is like the difference between parties. Once you put it in these terms, the difference between parties taking more or less or whatever is kind of like negligible compared to sharing and so on. So it really is kind of like this forcing influence to get everybody to kind of agree to just coordinate as opposed to taking more and so on. And it's also worth pointing out that when people get into conflict, they destroy a lot of resources and they hold each other back and they prevent progress, or they could wipe out the species. And that risk profile in reality is much more pronounced than this. That like red line should really be kind of like going from like 0 bulging out all the way out and back. It's kind of like a scarier picture of the diagram. So the question is like, how do we get there? How do we go from where we are today to that Pyrotopian potential? CryptoEcon, that's how we get there. The cryptoeconomic stuff that we were talking about is extremely powerful. So the crypto community in general thinks of this as like really powerful and so on. Like we know kind of how cool programmable money is and how cool incentive structures are and so on. But in reality, they're just, it's way deeper than that. At the end of the day, all of these systems, from nation states to tribes to families and so on, they're just coordination structures. And what we have now is a way to marry like the digital computing platform that we have that is broadly diffused in the world with programmable incentive structures and programmable coordination structures. And so that is just super, super, super powerful. It can rewrite all of our economic systems. It can rewrite all our government systems. It can rewrite all ways in which humans coordinate. And so we're going to be seeing this kind of major improvement diffuse into major different parts of our life, into different verticals and so on over time. So this is extremely powerful stuff. This is a massive lever by which to kind of move mountains. This is a major tool by which how we can solve those like large scale problems. And just to kind of put it into like very clear perspective, just think of the Bitcoin hash rate. Before Bitcoin started, there was no Bitcoin network. When Bitcoin started, it had a few computers chugging away and burning a lot of hashes and so on. And the incentive structure did two things. Like the block reward incentive structure did two major things. One is it got a lot of people interested in this currency and gave them a little bit of the currency, and it broadly diffused. That emission rate enabled the currency to be distributed to a lot of people. And it created an incentive structure for paying the people to maintain the currency itself and paying the people for adding security to the network and so on. It also helped broadly diffuse the currency to a lot more people. But it had this kind of unintended consequence. Because that incentive structure was so powerful, and the computing power that had to go into kind of mining each block is just kind of, it absorbs any amount of power you throw at it. It created this runoff equilibrium for consuming as many resources as possible to secure the ledger. And so this is just kind of mediated by the price of Bitcoin. If the price of Bitcoin goes higher, more energy goes into securing the ledger. And so in a few short years, we've gone from like a tiny little network with maybe initially 1, 10, and so computers to now one of the largest energy-consuming processes on the planet. And in that time scale, it also had to kind of create the notion of virtual currencies and cryptocurrencies and so on. It had to create the entire crypto movement in its wake and so on. So that process was slowed down. You could redo something like this much faster now. And I would guess in 2 to 5 years, you can get something of this scale. And that just gives you a sense of how powerful this open and permissionless incentive structure is. We've gotten a taste of it with the Falco network. In a year and a half, we went from no storage in the network to 15, 16 exabytes, which is an enormous amount of storage capacity. So you go from bytes to kilobytes to megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes, and then exabytes, which is an enormous scale increase. I might have missed one. I think I got it right. But the point is, an enormous network appeared because of that incentive structure. So it just gives you a sense of the scale of change that you can have on the world by designing a good incentive structure and deploying it into the network. One important thing here is this is the sort of scale that now this is at the scale of major computing platforms like Google Cloud and Azure and so on. It's within 1 or 2 orders of magnitude, which is totally is super close. And that's where you can get with a year and a half and a super powerful incentive structure that is just coordinating that kind of network. So this the optimistic view on this is you can use these incentive structures to cause coordination at that scale and solve major problems in the world. So let's go back to this kind of mechanism design view of, hey, you have some complex surface area. I want you to kind of use this tool set of whenever you're encountering some large-scale problem, break it down into trying to visualize the incentive field and trying to think of what basin are people stuck in, what other basin could be better, and how do you get people from the basin they're stuck in into that better basin, and use the magic of cryptocurrency to kind of warp the incentive structure to enable the people stuck in the higher basin to flow into the lower basin. So kind of one way to think about this is you have your cryptoeconomic toolkit, which is represented here by a tunnel boring machine, and you're going to bore a hole from one of the basins into the other and kind of create the potential for all of that energy to flow. And you can keep doing so with a large problem, you can break it down into smaller things and keep making it basin to basin to basin to basin, create incentive structures along the way, and that way solve macro scale problems. And so this is how we can get to this Pyrotopian vision. This is how we can solve these major scale problems by coordinating humans at grander and grander scales. We don't really need to we don't have to convince everyone in the world. We don't have to convince nation states. We don't have to convince various governments. We can create incentive structures that are well designed, and that way kind of cause action at various different scales of the network. So think of a picture like this. This is how we get to Pyrodotopia. So it's extremely critical century. This is how we can solve those major problems, coordinate out of those X risks, and make sure this computing phase transition goes well. So now I'll give you I'll break down a couple examples with you to kind of give you a sense of how to apply this thinking, and then we'll talk through some ideas, and we'll end with how to get involved. So think of a massive problem how do we get the planet to go green and start being carbon negative and start fixing a ton of carbon on the planet? Well, you can get there by first creating a green industry. So if most of the industry in the world becomes green, then we can get pretty close to a green planet. You can do that if you have one industry that you can point to that is being phenomenally green, not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative, that is actively fixing carbon in the ground at great rates. If we can cause that to happen in the world, that industry will be looked at by many other industries as a strong competitor, and they'll be kind of forced to adapt to what that industry can do, or those industries will wane because people will select these other processes to go to the much greener potential. So how do we turn crypto into a fully green industry? Today we have things like the Bitcoin process, we have many other proof-of-work networks and so on that are not green and are consuming massive amounts of resources and carbonizing the planet. So the way we can get all of green crypto is if we get a few crypto networks to become fully green and start decarbonizing themselves and becoming carbon negative, and create incentive structures for the other crypto networks to follow suit, to adapt themselves to do the same thing that these other crypto networks that are much better are doing. So great, like let's do that with one. Let's start, this is what we're doing in the Filecoin project. We're making a green Filecoin so that we can be the greenest possible blockchain to then kind of help drag all of the other blockchains along with us. And so how do we get there? Well, we start first by thinking about the storage providers, which are the main parties that consume a lot of energy. There are many other groups as well, like let's start there, and enable storage providers to be fully green and get to the point where all storage providers in the network are not only carbon neutral, but carbon negative. If we can get that going, then we can get the entire Filecoin network to be green. If we can get that to happen, then we can get other blockchains to become green. If we can get all of crypto to be carbon negative strongly, then we can shift the entire industry world into that. And then if we can do that, then we can get to decarbonize the planet. And this is the kind of thing that if we can do in, if you can think of each one of these circles as achieving that on like a 2 to 3 year timescale, you could get out of this in 10 to 15 years. You can get to sort of like become like heavily carbon negative. Might take longer, but if a lot of us kind of work on these pieces, we can get there. And you can think of like using collaborative competition at each layer of the stack here to cause that kind of incentive cascade. So let's kind of break that down and like be super practical. So this, how do you do that? How do you take a crypto network and make it carbon neutral? So let's use crypto incentives. You can do things like measure the energy use, estimate the energy use of a particular storage provider. You can create a lower bound and an upper bound. You don't have to measure it perfectly. We'll get to measure it perfectly once we kind of add some devices and so on. But right now we can just estimate it and just take the upper bound and say, let's just assume that we're like in the worst possible case. And then after that, we'll kind of, if we're doing better than that, we can adjust. And then once you have that measure, you can then offset all of that or get renewable energy to be produced at exactly the same moment in time as you're pulling it out of the grid. So the energy grid is this really cool system where like all of the plants are pumping the energy into the grid at the same time, and all of the users are pulling energy out of it. So it makes it really difficult to trace who you're getting your energy from. But if you as a consumer of energy buy renewable energy credits from specific plants at specifically the times that you're drawing the energy out, you can make a very credible, verifiable argument that as you're pulling the energy out, you're paying for renewable energy to be put into the grid, precisely at the exact moment in time in which you're pulling it out. Now, if you do that, then you have a very strong, verifiable claim that you are, your entire operation is operating on renewable energy, and it is a green process. Now, if you, instead of just paying for that amount, you pay for like 5 times the amount of energy or 10 times the amount of energy, you now have a multiple. You now have a way of saying, when I pull energy out of the grid, I am paying for 5 times the amount of renewable energy to go into the grid. So it gives you a facility to become not only carbon neutral, but carbon negative. And so if you can look at all the storage providers on the Filecoin network and one by one figure out which grid they're in, and one by one start a rec buying process in that area, you can make all of the SPs in the Filecoin network become not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative. And then we are like done with like the first and part of the second circle. And then from there you can like scale it up to other parts of the network and kind of treat each increasing circle. We're kind of in part of this process, so it'll take a while. Yeah, it's like a pretty interesting problem, and there's all kinds of areas where crypto tooling and verifiable claims and zero knowledge computation and so on can come in to help this entire structure get much more verifiable green. And then you can use programmable money to cause all kinds of action. I'm going to maybe fast forward through to get to the science one, because I want to cover that one for a little bit. And yeah, if you want to you can check out all the dashboards. You can like get involved with this project, and you can And a big part of causing this sort of change is that not only do you have to have a technical solution, you have to create a large-scale social movement that enables a lot of other parties to participate, to come up with more ideas, to improve the system, and to then scale it, to copy it to other places and to scale it. So think of all of this as generating public goods that many parties in the world can learn from and can use and so on. Cool, so let's go into accelerating progress. So a lot of this global improvement that we talked about, at the end of the day, has been a consequence of the science and technology process. So science is the process that humans use to expand our knowledge, to get to know more about the universe. And the technology build-out is about building tools and systems to leverage that knowledge to increase our capabilities on the planet. So these are kind of two sides of the same coin. And part of the reason the internet has been so impactful is that at the end of the day, what it really is a way of doing this process much faster and kind of letting it feed back on itself at a greater degree. So if we want to kind of accelerate global progress and accelerate the rate at which we're solving tons of problems, one thing you can do, one high leverage thing you can do, is you can think of the entire pipeline from basic science to fundamental development to designing devices that put those ideas into kind of early notions of technology, and then get all the way into products and diffuse that technology into the world. And you can think of that entire pipeline and create incentive structures to fund it at better scales, to create this like regenerative crypto-econ loop where you're taking kind of outputs at the end of the pipeline when you're able to kind of create a lot of cash flow and then feed it back through the entire process at every point in the way to accelerate the diffusion of like basic science all the way through that pipeline to the end. Today, like the funding scales for basic research and basic fundamental development are not great. We'll see them in a moment. And especially in the middle, in this research development part, there's a huge chasm. So there's a missing set of coordination structures that enable this technology translation. And many times, many of us can imagine many problems that we are frustrated by in the world. And we know that there are communities out there that like know really good solutions and have like, you can find tons of papers and you can find tons of solutions discussed. And yet those solutions haven't made it into technology, haven't made it into products, haven't been broadly diffused. Something has happened along the way where like some of those efforts just got stuck somewhere. They didn't make it all the way. Sometimes some ideas don't make sense or they're not as effective as others. But many times what's going on is some ideas getting roadblocked and there's no funding to enable the people that want to get it to completion to actually do that. Or there was some funding, but that team failed. And you need a much more robust approach where you're funding many teams at the same time or in sequence to make that technology translation happen. So this problem exists because there's no good way of like creating profit structures in the middle here. Like there's the incentive fields here are broken. So we can use Regen CryptoEcon to fund this. So you can think of like the whole science funding structure and funding scale, and this is kind of what I mentioned about, hey, it's big, but it's not that big. And that has roughly remained similar decade over decade. It has increased a bit, but not dramatically. This is just the US, other nations, and this is one of the biggest circles on the planet. China is now really big. It didn't used to be that big. So it's a good sample of like the amount of funding in the world that is going towards R&D. You can use crypto to scale this. So crypto is not that big yet to be able to kind of fund this year over year. But if crypto gets 1 or 2 orders of magnitude larger, we're basically there. We're basically able to, crypto is going to be able to fund R&D at the scale of nation states. And that is massive. That kind of shift could be transformative for the world. If suddenly, like, as a scientist or an R&D person and so on, you can get funding not just from the NSF and IH or like the equivalent agencies in other countries, but you can now get funded by crypto networks at this massive scale. That could just ripple through the entire system to solve major planetary problems. And if you kind of like don't just stop at the early beginning, the way that the modern nation states do, but you kind of like create incentive structures throughout this pipeline to help push things along that entire chasm, to make sure that there's a really solid incentive field through this whole thing, then we can really scale up the technology translation pipeline, and at that point get a lot of the big solutions that we need in the world actually implemented and scaled. And way to kind of visualize these things that's helpful is like think of large-scale projects as again breaking down into smaller things, And you can get a lot of action to happen if you have a reliable way to kind of start small and scale up. If you have ways of starting small projects, prove them out, and scale them, then you can be in a really good place. And part of the reason we have so many scaled up startups and products that have, for the last 20 years, had these like super fast growth rates is because we have a phenomenally good capital structure in private funding where you can do this kind of scaling at every step of the way. So it's very easy for groups that are very close to a product to get funding at larger and larger scales to be able to achieve this outcome. But the same is not for, this is not the same for public goods. Public goods has a pretty broken funding structure where in the smaller scales it's massive. There's just tons of money flowing into charities. A lot of that funding is lost. A lot of that funding is even negative. There's like bad accounting of the impact of that funding. And then once you start getting into larger scales, there's fewer and fewer and fewer funders, and you get to certain scales where like there's just no funding available. This is why we have this concept of fusion never, where like fusion never got the funding it needed to actually get done and researched in time. We're finally breaking that, but like it took like 40 years more than we needed. And so if you can create a funding staircase for public goods similar to this one at similar scales, then we can be in a much better place. The scale here is like massive, and this is all a decentralized system. Like the private venture capital system is all pretty decentralized with many different actors that are part of this incentive structure, incentive field that enable them to kind of collaboratively compete to fund startups at in better ways and so on and larger scales. Can we create a similar kind of structure for a funding staircase for public goods? I think one of the highest leverage ways to impact the major problems in the world is to do this. And you can do it with CryptoEcon. You can do things like create new funding structures, new grant programs. You can take things like what Gitcoin's doing and scale it up, like go from the quadratic funding type structures that work really well for the small crypto projects and scale it up to build out entire crypto networks, or scale it up to do science research and scale it up to do full technology translation. You can come up with better mechanisms to pair the funding proposal structure with the impact and so on. And so you can use the CryptoEcon tooling to greatly improve the structure. So things like you can even think of things like Patreon and so on as like examples of doing this. So there's a whole like field of potential design here, and there's a bunch of groups now starting to actively pursue these kinds of things. So I greatly encourage you to get involved. We're now at time, so quick question. Is there another speaker that is about to jump in? Great, so I'm gonna pause here and maybe conclude with, hopefully I've given you a bunch of different region ideas. I'll be out there and we can talk more if you want to explore more. And the last thing is get involved by going to the conferences and communities that are talking about these region ideas. Go listen to like the Green Pill podcast. Go watch the videos from Shelling Point that happened 2 days ago. Go to the next one, and come to Funding the Commons, which is happening in June. Great. So let's all make it by aligning ourselves towards the Pyrotopian outcome and solve the large-scale planetary problems with crypto. Thanks.